Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Wallace here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm an evolutionary epidemiologist with the People's CDC here with an update on the COVID-19 pandemic. This week, we'll cover the state of global COVID and the state of U.S. COVID, following up on President Biden's State of the Union and declaration of the end of the public health emergency for COVID-19 come May 11th. We'll also address the actual state of the pandemic. My apologies, my voice is off kilter this week, but I will do my very best. We begin with global COVID. In the graph in red, the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center reports us at 1.18 million new confirmed COVID cases worldwide for the week ending February 12th, a low in new cases we haven't seen since late June 2020, but still more than 1 million cases when countries around the world are rolling back their surveillance programs. The number of global weekly deaths there in white is reporting in at 8,725 confirmed deaths this past week. In green, we see global vaccinations up to 81 million for the week. Now, the Johns Hopkins website from which we've drawn these data since the start of COVID this week is slated to be closed in March. The New York Times map shows hotspots over the past week. Cases per 100,000 population are down worldwide from mid-January. Even the long-term entrenched outbreaks in Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand have downshifted. Austria and Taiwan remain top-tier epicenters, and the Republic of Congo is reporting in a new increase. But that doesn't mean COVID-19 is down and out. As we can see from these percent changes in caseloads the past couple weeks, rebounds there in warm colors are still scattered across the globe. In the Western Hemisphere, Panama and Haiti have heated up. In Europe, Switzerland, Poland, and less so, Great Britain and parts of Eastern Europe have hosted increases. Across Eurasia, Russia, Kyrgyzstan, and India are hosting substantial increases, while Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Taiwan hosted slighter increases. In Africa, Uganda, Chad, Central African Republic, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, and Togo showed sharp increases, with lesser increases elsewhere on the continent. The Containment and Health Index offers a measure of the combination of non-pharmaceutical interventions countries are presently engaged, like mask mandates, testing, and contact tracing. Still the same end-of-year date as the previous COVID This Week broadcast, but with more countries reporting in. But we do see now, we've learned, the University of Oxford program from which Our World in Data draw these data announced it would no longer be reporting in the index. So this will be the last time we reported on COVID This Week, part of the deterioration of public data as governments and science units alike move toward acting as if the pandemic is over. And this is all at a time when the vaccine strategy many governments say they're pursuing instead of those non-pharmaceutical interventions is faltering. Much of the world is at best vaccinated for variants no longer circulating. We see uneven campaigns and booster vaccinations across the world. On the one hand, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, Cuba, Canada, Belgium, Finland, Germany, Italy, Australia, and Japan showed top-tier booster campaigns with 70 or more people boosted per 100 population. In contrast, we see near nothing in Russia, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and those even reporting in from Africa, as well as mediocre campaigns in the US, Mexico, Brazil, China, and Eastern Europe. This map also hasn't changed much, although it's being shown to be reported updated February 9th. The CDC reports the US at a little under 16% of its eligible population 5 years and older with an updated booster dose. The mediocre vaccination campaigns, hand in hand with the rollback of the non-pharmaceutical campaigns that successful vaccination depends on, have been taking place alongside the emergence of multiple Omicron subvariants now circulating across large expanses of the world. As of January 30th, we see a general shift in variants since we last checked in with those countries subtyping their COVID samples, largely biased to more high-income countries. We see that, save for China, BA.5 in blue is falling back in the face of BQ1 in salmon, XBB in purple, and new recombinants in green. Here we see the diversity of variants within China as reported by China CDC as of February 2nd, with the BA 5.2.48 sublineage in blue, BA 5.2.49 in green, and BF 7.14 in red. with other variants reported too, including some familiar faces like BA2, BN1, BQ1.1, and XBB.1, but also other novel strains. New phylogeographies out of Nigeria show the geographic dynamics of second wave SARS-2. Plots A and B here show the team sampling effort. C shows the geographic distribution of various sample sublineages. D here shows the sublineages as inferred over time, with new sublineages replacing one another and strains coexisting together. Finally, E shows inferences of the variety of locations the samples were taken over time, with home samples largely steady over time and stores and transit locations increasing through 2021 as Nigeria reopened. The team also showed two sublineages originated in Africa, including one from Nigeria itself, before spreading by regional transportation to other nearby countries and the rest of the world. The team concludes there's been a lot more viral movement among African countries than previously reported. But diversity isn't just found within and between countries. New work shows SARS-2 viral diversity emerges within individual patients, with viral evolution compartmentalized by organ system. The Broad Institute of Harvard team pursued deep genetic sequencing in 6 COVID patients in the upper left, finding differences in viral load across body parts and patients in the trachea, stomach, bladder, bowel, heart, thyroid, testes, spleen, liver, and so on. The team also produced phylogenies of the samples, finding that the majority of the 180 viral variants identified within their subjects were specific to individual tissues. They also found the longer the disease course, the more high-frequency minor variants were found. One of the 6 subjects harbored 10 such minor variants entirely in tissues other than the lungs. Indeed, one such variant expressed a non-synonymous mutation in the furin cleavage site of the spike protein. That means evolution produced new adaptations beyond neutral changes. The top figure shows the number of samples for each separate variant across the 6 patients, the number of days from symptom onset to death in the black bars underneath. The bottom figure shows on the left all the minor, those under 10%, and major variants across the SARS-2 genome found in a single patient, with those in gray producing synonymous changes, meaning changes that didn't really make a difference in the molecule, and those in red producing functionally new changes. The figure on the right shows a rough evolutionary tree of all the variants found across this single patient's body parts in comparison to the original Wuhan strain. And we're learning more about the durations infections persist. As previously reported on COVID this week, autopsies found SARS-2 replicating in bodies up to a year after the initial infection. New work is finding high titers of infectious virus in 55% of the corpses tested, with the longest post-mortem infection lasting 13 days after death, 12 of those spent in a refrigerator. So while SARS-2 continues to spread and evolve at multiple scales, including after death, the virus's evolved resistance to monoclonal antibodies widely reported, with not a single monoclonal antibody now working in the United States, along with all the developing resistance to Paxlovid, is now joined by new work showing Paxlovid little helpful in severely ill COVID patients compared to standard treatment. In short, on the daily, we are learning new ways the virus is able to evolve and persist, while also learning the new ways our biomedical tools are declining in their efficaciousness. Turning to the US, we see from the Walgreens COVID-19 index that as of February 14th, national test positivity holding steady, still at a third positive for both rapid tests and PCR, even off its January peak. The CDC reports 3,171 Americans died from COVID last week. This New York Times map shows COVID cases per 100,000 population. Spatially, the national caseload looks rolled back from mid-January, except where it's not. We see caseloads seemingly peeled back from the Northwest down through California to the Four Corners. West Texas appears clearing up, as does Florida, however suspect its data. Some of the Mississippi River states appear clearer: Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas. On the other hand, the Plain States appear newly hit again, including Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. The South still looks hit, including Mississippi, Alabama, in and around Birmingham, up into Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Carolinas. Alaska is also hosting an outbreak, while Puerto Rico appears better resolved. Other modes of tracking COVID-19 are patchy at best, given uneven coverage. We see the levels of SARS-2 virus detected in the wastewater that comes through our sewage plants, in some ways a leading indicator of the pandemic, for January 5th through February 8th. We see a mixed geography of hot and cold spots at both the regional level and the state level. So, for instance, California is off its January peak, but with some Bay Area plants in orange at 60% or more of all the samples taken nationally since December 2021. We see Salt Lake City, eastern Nebraska, but especially the industrial Midwest, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio getting hit. But also through the South, Alabama, the Carolinas, Virginia, and West Virginia, and farther north, Delaware to upstate New York and up into Maine. However, the more acute measures of changes in sewage loads over the past 15 days perhaps better show transient dynamics. We see compared to January, heating up across the country. The Northwest, less so in California, Utah and Colorado, Missouri and Arkansas, the Appalachian states, and New York from New York City to upstate. Here are the fractions of hospital beds filled by COVID patients across the 4,000 plus hospitals reporting as of February 4th, as mapped by People CDC's Les Schaffer. We see, in spite of declines in caseloads, many urban hospitals are hosting large cohorts of COVID cases there in red, but we see the demand bleed outward into local regions. So, for instance, we see high demand to supply in the Twin Cities here, also sharply felt out beyond their suburbs and into farm country. The demand may be a function of COVID load, bed availability, and an area's underlying susceptibility, often deeply embedded in its socioeconomic bedrock. To sum up, here's the People CDC version of our present community transmission by county as of February 14th, mapped again by our own Les Schaffer. This map shows the combo of caseloads and test positivity that the CDC plots, now reporting only once a week, but unlike the CDC, the People CDC differentiates the high level of danger counties are subjected to beyond 10% COVID positivity into high, very high, and extremely high exposure. Down at the bottom, we see that the People CDC also differentiates exposure by both of the percent of counties and by the percent population. The CDC reports 3 caveats in their reported data this week. Delays affect the reported cases for 3 states, Utah, New Mexico, and Maine. Overall, we see a continuing spatial contraction here in the US. We see the peeling back we previously discussed from the Northwest, eastwards into the Dakotas and southward to the Four Corners in Texas. We see sharp epicenters in Alaska, down through the Plain States, Alabama, and Tennessee. That ugly swatch across the Carolinas has resolved, but only down to high exposure. We're down to 60% of the American people in communities subjected to extremely high COVID exposure. That's good news, but we have another 34.5% subjected to substantial exposure. The outbreak stateside continues to evolve, with here the continued explosive emergence of XBB 1.5, with BQ.1 and BQ 1.1 still represented. Although this is entirely dependent on place. Here's the 15-day trend of all the genetic sequences of detected sublineages in the US as of February 13th, including their geographic origins. XBB 1.5 in blue is indeed outcompeting BQ1 in gray and BQ 1.1 in red as far as new sequences added to the database. With XBB 1.5 starting in New York City, spreading by hierarchical diffusion to the rest of the country. But there are all sorts of other subvariants and sublineages circulating out there in such a way as to offer possible candidates for the next dominant variant or to contribute to the next recombinant that accelerates beyond both vaccine and population immunity. Many of them are sublineages of BQ 1.1, but there's also CH 1.1, XBB, DF 1.1, and BR2. Now multiply that diversity by the world, and we have a pandemic still very much in play. We end the broadcast with our own state of the pandemic. President Biden told 1,000 maskless people at his State of the Union, quote, "Today, COVID no longer controls our lives, end quote. Tell that to the 20,000 plus Americans who have died of COVID since the turn of the new year. By the CDC's own measure, we see the drumbeat of excess deaths here attributable to COVID continues. Or tell that to the as many as 36 million Americans who have suffered long COVID, some now for over a year and counting. Alongside the terrible health consequences, the economic damage is substantial. In previous broadcasts, we touched on the decline in the size of the workforce, the failure to fill positions, and the millions of workers out every week taking care of their COVID sick selves or loved ones. The New York State Insurance Fund just put out a report showing long COVID claimants with long COVID symptoms for 6 months or more were less likely to return to work. But the bipartisan decision has been to pivot clear of the outbreak, not by controlling the infection. Here, CDC Director Rochelle Walensky declared that we could not stop the virus, but by declaring the pandemic over, whatever the consequences. Why? Another example in a different context might help clarify. In Ohio, in what some are calling the Chernobyl or Bhopal of East Palestine, an oh-so-literal bomb train carrying vinyl chloride, butyl arsenate, benzene residue, and combustible liquid crashed and exploded. By successful federal lobbying, the train was allowed to be classified as non-hazardous to save money for Norfolk Southern, the rail company whose train it was. The explosion, or rather the controlled release, has likely led to hydrochloric acid and formaldehyde raining down over and beyond an area evacuated 1 mile by 2 mile. Indeed, the Ohio River, which provides drinking water to 5 million people and serves as home to 10% of the American people, appears now polluted. Norfolk Southern, which is worth $55 billion, making nearly $13 billion in 2022, and beginning a $10 billion stock buyback using debt financing despite record profits, is offering East Palestine residents the equivalent compensation of $5 each. Norfolk Southern has been involved in similar crashes in 2005, 2006, and 2012, among others. The first shown here releasing chlorine gas. Railways, increasingly owned by venture capital in what is now one of the most lucrative sectors, are off the rails. 71% of Norfolk Southern shares are owned by Wall Street, including the Vanguard Group, BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Capital Research and Management, among others. Here, a financial analyst described Norfolk Southern's potential as only starting to be realized, with cash return on invested capital in blue only starting to run atop cost of equity post-2016. Simply Wall Street reports that, quote, Northern Southern announced that its board of directors approved a 9% increase on its quarterly dividend on the company's common stock from $1.24 to $1.35 per share, end quote. The dividend is to be paid February 21st to shareholders of record on February 3rd, the day of the accident. Financializing such fixed infrastructure upon which the near entirety of U.S. capital depends offers an appropriate analogy for more recent efforts COVID underscored to monetize public health out of existence and into the kinds of biomedical commodities the Biden administration favors. If you recall, in December, on the basis of the critical nature of rail, Biden and Congress rushed to record speed bipartisanship to quash a rail strike aimed at intervening against the flagrant practices that led to such accidents. Rail workers were asking for more sick days, yes, but also reversing work hour increases, cost cutting, automation, and reduced crew sizes. Just-in-time precision scheduled railroading, like deprofessionalizing and understaffing hospitals, squeezes the maintenance and inspections that protect workers and communities from disaster. All while the sector increases train length and tonnage and sheds nearly a quarter of its workforce. There's nothing accidental about these events, however much the National Transportation Safety Board can't get its head around why an experienced crew, however well rested, would forget to reline a switch. And there's also nothing accidental about 1.1 million Americans dead from COVID over the past 3 years. The damage is institutional, detonating far beyond a single train or emergency room and out to the totality of a nation's web of social relations and how we choose to organize ourselves as a society. If rail is so important that Congress must intervene to stop a strike, then certainly it is so important that it wouldn't be deregulated into just another kind of asset stripping, squeezing profit out of every train and rail worker and sped up inspection. The issue is that the country is organized around an economistic ethos that treats equity as realer than actual steel rail and human flesh and Ohio River drinking water flowing across a basin of 10 states. And it's an outcome expressed across the entirety of the US's infrastructure. Here are the grades the American Society of Civil Engineers offered across infrastructure category. And they're terrible. C's and D's, with, ironically, rail earning the highest grade of B in 2021. But it's this ethos why the Biden administration has said nary a word about East Palestine and why it's aimed to bury COVID. Some things are thought more important than the health and well-being of the American people. In the face of such an attitude, we'll end exactly as we finished our January 17th episode. We need a more organized campaign that forces the system to put human health and well-being before profits and producing millions of long COVID cases. As these New York City nurses successfully struck for in their fight for the kind of increased staffing that could have kept the Ohio train from derailing in the rail sector. Clearly, a pandemic reaches well beyond a hospital, but efforts along these lines and out into hiring 1 million community health workers alongside pandemic financial aid and scaled up public health intervention could have saved many of the 1.1 million Americans two administrations let die. Now we can get in some practice to start. To push back against the end of the public health emergency, the People's CDC launched an easy-to-do letter writing campaign to which tens of thousands have already submitted letters. With the end of the emergency, the near entirety of the public response to COVID will be privatized. People will lose access to free rapid and PCR tests. Vaccines and Paxlovid are scheduled to spike in price. 15 million people will be kicked off Medicaid. Telehealth for Medicare patients will be scaled back. Now add your name to the letter and think of these as much as messages to ourselves about our roles when we are abandoned as a notice of intent to the White House. We've put the link in the video description. Next up, hit the streets to support railway workers or nurses or Uber drivers or anyone else demanding the kinds of staffing and health and safety protections that protect us all. And that's COVID This Week from the People's CDC. You can learn more about the People's CDC and read this week's COVID weather report at our website, peoplescdc.org.